Hello, I'm Roger Ream. Thanks for joining us for this conversation with Congressman Ron Paul. Congressman Paul's guest today is Dominick Armentano, Professor of Economics at the University of Hartford. Professor Armentano is a leading authority on antitrust and monopoly and is the author of 2 books on the subject. Professor Armentano, you've done a great deal of research on antitrust and monopoly. Do we really need laws to protect us against monopoly?
No, I don't think we do. I think monopoly is a serious problem, but I don't think the antitrust laws protect us from monopoly. The source of monopoly is governmental power, and the antitrust laws are really irrelevant to that particular issue.
Congressman Paul, do you agree?
I certainly do, and it's one of those points of view that I've changed my mind on. I would have to say that maybe 15 or 20 years ago, after leaving college and having studied economics at college a bit, I would have said absolutely they're necessary. This is what I had been told. But I think over the years in studying and reading some of Professor Armentano's works, I've been convinced. I'm convinced that the legislation against monopoly is much more harmful than helpful. I think they serve a purpose which is contrary to what we want. If we are against monopoly, we should be making sure that government doesn't protect monopoly. And here we go with this pretense that we're always breaking up monopoly, and yet we're always protecting monopolies. And I think it's very disturbing, because generally people are opposed to monopolies and they see there's a lot of power, but they don't quite understand how this operates and how government really gives the power to the big companies.
Professor Armentano, let's start with some basics. What are antitrust laws?
Well, the oldest antitrust law is the Sherman Antitrust Act. It's 93 years old. It's our oldest industrial policy, actually. And that law deals with conspiracies and restraint of trade and attempts to monopolize. The other major piece of legislation is the Clayton Act, passed in 1914, which basically bans or restricts price discrimination, so-called tying agreements, and mergers.
Do businessmen support these laws?
I think businessmen generally do support these laws, which should make us leery as to the actual intent and purpose of the antitrust laws. Businessmen generally support the antitrust laws. In fact, most of the time, the laws are employed by businessmen, by corporations, against other corporations. I think a little-known fact is that 95% of all the antitrust cases that are not brought by the government, but are brought by one firm suing another firm. And usually the defendant company is a company that's aggressively competitive, so that the company that's being sued is making life competitively rough for the company that's suing it.
So what you're saying is they're literally using these laws in a perverse way. Instead of breaking up a monopoly, they're using those to secure the monopoly or secure protection for themselves.
That's right. The laws actually are protectionist in effect. Although the intent is to preserve competition and promote it, the effect of the laws is to restrain and restrict competition. So the laws, like a lot of laws, achieve the opposite of the result intended.
Congressman Paul, you're an advocate of the free market and the free market economy. Therefore, I assume you believe competition is important. Isn't there a role for government to ensure that we have competition in the marketplace?
Yes, I think so. And I think as long as you enforce the law equally, and that is protect freedom for everybody across the board, then you're going to have competition. If you protect the concept of the voluntary contract, which I think people have just about forgotten about, that you can't today easily draw up a contract which the government doesn't interfere in. They're always telling you what you can do and what you can't do and who you can hire and what you should pay them. So they're always interfering with this voluntarism in the market. So I would say there's a lot government could do, but it's almost in a negative way, that is to prohibit the monopoly from developing by special privilege. But yes, they have a role to play, but not by passing a law telling that a company can't get any bigger. That's where I see the harm, where they say that 70% or 80% is too big and then therefore it's harmful. Because this is the market telling us something. What we're doing is literally destroying an important piece of information. And that is that if you're getting big, you're usually getting big because you're doing something for the consumer. And the consumer should be the deciding factor. If you're not doing the job right, if you're not providing the right commodity at the right price, that businessman will go out of business. But today, if you get too big because you've satisfied a lot of consumers, then the government comes in and wants to interrupt this. And also they want to overtax you. In another sense, if a company is weak, because they're inefficient, we literally go in and we subsidize them. So I think we do exactly the opposite thing. The government certainly has a role to play, but it's quite a bit different than the role that we take here in Washington.
Well, Dr. Armentano, without antitrust laws, wouldn't businesses conspire at the expense of the consumer?
Well, I think we have to remember that prior to 1890, there were no antitrust laws. And what I always challenge people to do is find an effective case, or find an example of effective conspiracy prior to the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, we know that businessmen rarely get together but that they hatch a conspiracy against the public, to quote Adam Smith. But the point is, these conspiracies are usually very short-lived. The railroads, prior to the passage of the Sherman Act, used to attempt to fix rates. And they were so unsuccessful at it that they demanded the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission, which effectively fixed rates for almost 100 years. So I think that businessmen can and do cooperate. You can call it collusion if you want to, which I think is a pejorative term. But I don't think normally in open markets attempts to conspire are injurious to the consumer's welfare.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you agree, Congressman?
Yeah, I certainly do. I've been wondering about one thing that I never had a full explanation on, and that is with the monopoly that occurs sometimes in a free market. Are they necessarily bad? And what is the answer to that? Aren't there times when government doesn't interfere that a company might provide 99% of a product, and yet it seems to have a market price to it? Where does that market price come from if there's nobody else producing that product?
Well, I think you gave the answer before. It's certainly not bad. If I produce a product and do it so successfully, let's say by lowering my price and improving the quality and advertising the product effectively, such that my market share expands so that consumers refuse to buy, let's say, substitute products from other producers so that I get the whole market. If that's the way the monopoly is achieved, then I would put quotes around the use of monopoly in that sense. That's what I call a free market monopoly. Now, that's very rare. Normally, firms are not able to anticipate consumer demand and supplier costs and innovation to the extent that they are always successful and therefore achieve a market position where there's no other competitors. But there's nothing regrettable about the fact that a firm can do it. Alcoa is a good example of a firm that retained, in some sense, depending on how you define the market, a 100% market share. But they did it by lowering the price and expanding the output and improving the quality of the product.
So they literally have to not only compete against other aluminum makers, they have to compete against other products as well.
Sure.
And also knowing if their price gets too high, that's going to invite somebody else coming in, so they have an incentive, even though he doesn't exist, keep that price at a market level.
Potential competition. When aluminum came on the market, it sold for $8 an ingot pound. Now, that's not going to compete with other structural materials in the market, so what Alcoa did is reduce the price progressively over 50 years so that at the time of the antitrust case against Alcoa, it was selling for 22 cents a pound. Now, they were convicted for monopolizing aluminum, even though they had reduced the price and increased the output.
Well, this raises a question about what we should be doing here in Washington. Of course, you and I might agree we ought to get rid of the laws, but isn't it practically impossible for even the most sincere businessman to interpret the laws? Because if the price is all the same, we're in collusion. If it's too high, that means we control it and we're gouging in public. If it's too low, we're trying to kill our competitors. It seems like the government can say that you're defying the antitrust laws no matter what you do.
The laws are arbitrary. The laws are unjust, therefore. You know, even Adam Smith didn't think we needed a law against price fixing because he said, I don't think you can enforce a law like that consistent with liberty and justice. You'll inevitably interfere with the liberty and justice of business people because the laws are so arbitrary and unfair. They're ex post facto laws. Also, you only find out what you've done after you've done it.
If businessmen are making use of these laws, and we can see how they do this, and we really have monopolies because they have government protection, why don't we have our consumer groups doing more for the consumer? Obviously, it hurts the consumer to have these laws on the books and to protect big business and their monopolies. It seems like it should be consumerism. And why are we missing the boat? Why is it the marketplace hasn't protected the consumer, at least been an advocate of the consumer? That to me seems to be a political plus for us if we could only do that, and yet we don't translate that into consumerism.
I think consumerism is picking up on the antitrust laws. I think the antitrust laws were a myth and a hoax for 80 years. But beginning around 10 years ago, there's been a lot of work in this area. I'm not alone in arguing that the antitrust laws are anti-consumer and have worked in an anti-consumer way. And you've had a lot of people in the consumerist movement pick up on this and call for reform, not repeal, unfortunately, but reform of the antitrust laws. And this administration certainly should be credited with doing some reform. Some of the real bad antitrust cases have been dropped away, and some of the really anti-competitive enforcement of the antitrust law has been dropped away by this administration.
When you talk about antitrust laws, do you include laws or regulations of the government that lead to less competition? For instance, the government for years regulated airlines in this country, and I think it's since the CAB was founded there wasn't another airline in the business of transporting passengers. Is that, in a sense, an antitrust law?
No, that's an anti-competition law.
Right. Are those
and
kind of
almost all regulation is anti-competition, and the movement to deregulate is pro-competitive. The real issue there, though, is once we deregulate, should we then apply the antitrust laws to the deregulated industries? And almost all the antitrust advocates say, yes, now we have to apply the antitrust laws to the deregulated air carriers. I say no. I say no, because a free market is precisely that, a market that is free of intervention. And once you remove the regulation, the market will be competitive, as long as there's the possibility of open entry, and there's been plenty of entry, of course, into the air carrier business. So I would not apply the antitrust laws to the air carriers.
Congressman Paul, what do you think the chances are that Congress is going to repeal antitrust laws?
The chances of us getting a vote on something like that is essentially nil, and if it did come up, I imagine there'd be 1% of us who would endorse the idea of the free market, even with application to the antitrust. So I would say the understanding is practically absent here, unfortunately. Yet, hopefully, I think the trend is in our direction that more and more understand this, and maybe another 10 years that'll be completely different. I certainly hope so. Because out of a practical need. I mean, we have monetary problems and we have fiscal problems, but we have competition problems too. And I think along this line about competition and maximizing, and frequently is discussed when you talk about antitrust laws, and that has to do with the tariffs. It seems like big business was protected, and they did have a large portion of the market back in the latter part of the 19th century, but there were also people who believed in the tariffs. That's why they were big frequently. So I don't know whether we can isolate this out here and just say it's antitrust. For full competition, full market, we have to address the antitrust, we have to address the regulations that protect certain companies, but then the tariff issue too. And yet, boy, the sentiment here, not only is the sentiment strongly opposed to any repeal of antitrust, it is sure protectionist lately, and this is discouraging. It's, because we've ruined the international trade, mainly because I think we've ruined international currencies and financing. Therefore, we're resorting to tariffs, and I see this as a bad sign.
In 1890, the two issues in the Congress were the tariff and the antitrust laws, and it's argued that the Republicans supported the antitrust law because they didn't want to go on record as being the pro-tariff party, the pro-monopoly party. They favored tariffs, and everyone knew tariffs created monopolies, or at least protected monopolies, and it was the chairman of the U.S. Sugar Company who said the tariff is the mother of the trust. Mr. Havemeyer in 1893 said that. So the Republicans took a position in 1890 that they would favor the Sherman Act because they thought that would cover them with their constituency, because their constituency would believe that they were against the trust.
A typical
because they favored the Sherman Act.
An example of how one intervention leads to another one or two more government interventions.
Precisely.
Well, if antitrust laws are anti-consumer, why aren't they going to be repealed? Is it that congressmen haven't got the message? Do most people in the economics profession hold your view?
15 years ago, if you had tried to find one political person who would have said, we can repeal airlines regulation, you couldn't find it. It takes time before the mood is right and the politics is right to repeal legislation. And yet it was 15 years ago, I believe, that a professor by the name of Levine wrote the first important article that was published in the Journal of Law and Economics that said we can deregulate the airlines industry and rates will go down. This is pro-consumer. Up until that point, everyone believed that regulation was pro-consumer. So I think it is a slow process. Ideas take time to filter down through.
Has that been your experience?
I think this is certainly the case, but what I find frustrating is that the members here respond to a technical argument, say they could be convinced of deregulation for airlines, and then they will support it. But those same individuals might be the strongest for regulation of, say, the price of oil and gas. they don't approach things with a basic principle and saying, you know, freedom is the best, the market is the best way to deliver goods and services. They approach it in a very pragmatic way. Not that we should deny their support when it comes, but to me it would be so much easier if we could convince them of basic principles, and then this all falls into place. But I guess we take whatever we can get piecemeal.
I don't want to wait 100 years to get the antitrust laws repealed.
Yeah, well, good.
So I'll take what I can get.
Right.
Is it naive to think that in the absence of antitrust laws, we'd have this perfect competition that the economists talk about, that we wouldn't have collusion at the expense of the consumer?
Well, I think there's a couple of mistakes in that question. The first is, I think it's naive to believe that antitrust works in the interest of the consumer and is pro-competitive. The second thing is, I don't believe in perfect competition. And I think it is naive to believe that the repeal of the antitrust laws would produce perfect competition. I'm talking about an openly competitive market, and that is a market where the government does not restrict production or exchange, where there are no tariffs, no quotas, no entry restrictions. I would remove the antitrust laws also, and then you get what I call an openly competitive market, not a perfectly competitive market. That's that's a technical model that the economist has built and has no practical usefulness as far as I'm concerned. So I don't think we can achieve that. I don't think that would be in the interest of the consumer, frankly. But an openly competitive market, that is achievable. How to achieve it? Simply remove the restrictions on entry into the market.
You know, I think when people hear us talk, they might be thinking about steel and aluminum and different things, but what about utilities? Most people assume, you know, just a blanket, in a blanket fashion, that utilities must be run by the government or regulated by governments. Do you think it's real practical to start talking about having several electric companies or allowing free?
There are many markets that are served by more than one electric
company. But this is generally not known. I do know that there are some cities now that do have a couple electric companies present, but I think it's breaking into this attitude, which is sort of fixed in people's mind, that you can't have competition even in the area of utilities.
Well, there's been a lot of work done by economists in this area. And what we've seen is that rapidly changing technology is obsoleting all our ideas about regulating and about natural monopoly and about the whole utility notion. I mean, we're deregulating in telecommunications, which is a utility area. Why? Because we can't intelligently, nor should we, try to regulate conduct and performance and entry. It's simply impossible. So again, for good practical reasons, although not philosophical reasons, for good practical reasons, the government is drawing back in telecommunications. So certainly, I don't think any of these areas are naturally monopolistic. They are monopolistic only because the government impedes entry. In Connecticut, for example, we didn't get a utility commission regulating electric rates until 1916. Now, there were many, many companies selling power in the market prior to 1916, competitively. How did we get regulation? We got regulation because the leading power companies, seeing rates decline dramatically and profits deteriorate dramatically, demanded regulation, and that's where the Regulatory Commission came from. And Greg Jarrell has written an article in the Journal of Law and Economics on the origin of regulation in the electric utility industry, and this is what he finds, that the industry itself, not the consumers, demanded electric rate regulation.
Because it keeps out their competition.
Because it keeps out competition, exactly.
Well, what's happening now with the phone industry? I mean, we hear about the breakup of AT&T, which for years has had a virtual monopoly, it seems, over phone service. And the argument has been we can't have 5 or 6 telephone companies putting up lines on the street and competing. But with the advances in technology, it seems that now we can have some competition.
Remember, competition means an open market. It doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to have 2 or 30 companies competing directly against each other. It may be infeasible to have 5 telephone companies serving the same street. It depends on what consumers want. If consumers are willing to pay the cost of that kind of duplication, then there will be 5. Mm-hmm. Bell Telephone had a monopoly for 17 years, a government-enforced monopoly. Started way back in the 19th century, and I think it expired in 1892 or something like that. The minute those patents expired, competitors came in the market. There are 2,000 telephone companies in this country that came into the market after the Bell patents expired. Mm-hmm. Now, it was Bell, it was the American Telephone and Telegraph Company that said, we want franchised monopoly so that we can serve the consumer more efficiently. When at that precise time, consumers were being served more efficiently by newcomers who were coming into the market and competing away Bell's share. In fact, the newcomers in the telephone industry had more phones installed in the 10 years after the market was opened than Bell had installed in the first 17 years of its monopoly. So even the telephone business, or I should say precisely the telephone business, can be openly competitive. But we must remove the regulation. And we must not apply the antitrust laws to the companies once we've removed the regulations that restrict entry. That would defeat the whole purpose.
Congressman Paul, what's been your experience with businessmen who come to Washington to lobby? Is it lobbying for a freer market and open competition, or are they looking for protection from competition?
I would say that 9 times out of 10 at least, they're looking for government assistance. And that's sort of sad, because most of them are in the conservative camp. They'll come in and they'll say, you know, I want the budget balance. I'm pleased with you voting against big spending, and we don't want to have any more welfare programs. But then they'll say, oh, by the way, you know, this program that I'm interested in, I support. So I would say that businessmen are careless, if nothing else. And I think they've been conditioned and taught. It's not that they're evil in the sense that they're, you know, deliberately trying to get disadvantage, but I think they've been taught that a little bit of government intervention is beneficial, and they rationalize very easily and say, boy, this one I can understand. You know, if I have a subsidized loan in my industry, this is going to be helpful to me. And I think they're just very, very careless. And unfortunately, I see many business people as part of the problem. So I don't always see it on the welfare side, the person who wants food stamps or something else. That to me is a problem, and our federal government at least should never be involved in that. But as far as the businessman go, he's always looking for protection. One of the key areas that is very frustrating that we're dealing with in the Congress all the time is the foreign aid. Businessmen are frequently for foreign aid and subsidies to international banks because they say it's good for business. And they're precisely right. It's good for their business. And they said, yeah, but it helps my workers, and it helps my contractors, and it helps the business people that I buy my products from. And they rationalize and say, well, it's really good for business. But what they don't realize is that every dollar that they get allocated to them through foreign aid to a certain government, they have to take that from somebody else. And they never ask the question, who was hurt for them to benefit? And this, to me, is very frustrating that the businessman supports those views.
Well, when we talk about antitrust laws and monopoly, we generally talk about businesses. Can we also talk about unions when we talk about this? Do unions, in a sense, have a monopoly power? And should we have antitrust laws to try to keep control over unions?
Well, I think we have to be clear on the source of monopoly power. If the source of monopoly power is government restricting competition or restricting entry, then, sure, unions are monopolistic. Because the Wagner Act, the Norris-LaGuardia Act, the creation of the NLRB, all of those things, all of those pieces of legislation restrict competition between workers and give unions an artificial position that they probably would not achieve in an open free market. On the other hand, I don't want to apply the antitrust laws to unions as some political conservatives would do. The antitrust laws have not worked in a practical fashion applied to business. We ought not to apply those same laws, which are unjust, arbitrary, unfair, non-practical, to labor unions. So labor enjoys an exemption from the antitrust laws under the Clayton Act, Section 14. I support that exemption. I don't support labor union monopoly. I would repeal the Norris-LaGuardia Act. I would repeal the National Labor Relations Act, 1936.
So you'd have competing unions, in a sense. In a market situation, you could have competing unions.
Sure, I support unions. Yeah. Right, voluntary unions, absolutely.
Okay, so what you're saying then is if in a market you had a strong union developed because they were a good union and they provided the services for business, and they were still free entry, and they got the contract, and they had like a voluntary closed shop. Mm-hmm. That is, you would see no reason that we would have to have any laws to prohibit that, prohibit the closed shop, as long as there's free entry so that another union can come in and compete with that union to get that contract.
That's right. I'm against the closed shop. Right. I'm against laws that would restrict
prohibit
the closed shop.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, yes, I do, but it's a very difficult problem today because we literally benefit by the right to work laws in Texas because the states that don't have it suffer the abusive power of unions. And look at where the unemployment was in a recent recession in the states that did not have right to work laws. And yet I disagree with that approach, but that's compensated to some degree the evils of union power developed with government protection. But I would accept a big union that would have a closed shop, and I would not outlaw them if the free market were allowed to operate.
Well, I'd like to get back to the problem we touched on before is if these laws are unnecessary and harmful, and if regulation is brings about less competition, why isn't there more enthusiasm for repealing them, or what can be done to? Is it a question of education?
Well, I think it is a question of education. 85% of the economists recently polled said they still support the rigorous enforcement of the antitrust laws. So even though for the last 10 years some of us have been out screaming in the woods about how the laws work in an anti-competitive way, nonetheless, 85% of my fellow professionals still believe that the laws are good and are pro-consumer. So I think part of it definitely is an educational effort. But education is not enough. You then have to carry through those educational ideas at the policy level and move against these policies. And I think you have to do more than make administrative changes. I mean, William Baxter, who is the antitrust chief right now, has moved a long way towards reforming the antitrust laws. He's gotten a lot of the junk out, and a lot of the important cases that are bad cases have been dropped away. But I think we must go beyond that, because what happens when Baxter is replaced or leaves office, I can see us easily slipping back into the 60s and 70s kind of antitrust cases where we're prosecuting firms that are efficient because they're efficient.
Is there much sentiment? Well, more than that, you said about 95% of your colleagues probably would not favor repeal. Have you found that with the current administration, while there's been a change of sorts, that it's not something that's going to last in the years to come?
Well, I really don't think it will, because I think that unfortunately we make progress and then we slip back, because I've been lobbied very, very strenuously to try to reverse some of the effects of deregulation of the airlines. There have been some who have been very upset with it. They don't like this competition, and it's usually from a business level. I've not had a consumer that ever came in and said that they have objected to the lower fares and the more choices they have in airlines. So the consumer is being protected. So I'm always afraid that the people that come here to Washington have a greater influence, and yet they don't represent the majority of the people in this country. I think that it's unfortunate that our educational efforts aren't more effective, in that we can motivate the average guy on the street to write in and say, look, I'm for competition because I know in a competitive economy the consumer is the king.
I hate to interrupt, but I'm afraid we're out of time for today. Congressman Paul and I want to thank Professor Armentano for joining us for this discussion of antitrust and monopoly. We hope you've enjoyed this discussion and that you'll join us again 2 weeks from tonight for another conversation with Congressman Ron Paul.